This video provides a chronology of Edgar Allan Poe's life. The portrait that you see here, this is one of 8 daguerreotype photographs taken of Poe, and perhaps the most famous one, this is the so-called Ultima Thule portrait after a line from his 1844 poem Dreamland. Shows him in the fall of 1848. Difficult time for Poe, not long after he'd attempted to take his own life, which we'll talk about later. The furrowed brow, the sunken eyes, the aura of exhaustion and distress comports well with how most people today imagine Poe to have been in real life, a popular notion that obscures the truth, oversimplifies the man, and distorts his literary legacy. In this video, I will give an outline of the facts of Poe's life without the romance and speculation one often finds in many of the biographies and documentaries created about him. I will limit myself, for the most part, to details included in G.R. Thompson's biographical summary for the 2004 Norton Critical Edition. That's the text that we're using in this class, with some additional biographical information from Arthur Hobson Quinn's 1941 biography, which, although quite old, is still regarded by Poe scholars as the most complete, balanced, and accurate account ever written of Poe's life. In the interest of time, I avoid including broader historical facts, which will instead surface from time to time in our discussion of Poe's writings. For the same reason, with one or two exceptions, I will limit mention of specific stories and poems only to those selected for this course. I will, however, mention many of the publishers and periodicals with which Poe was directly involved, though certainly not all of them. The purpose of this outline is to identify significant events that had a direct impact on the trajectory of Poe's life, his family and relationships, his professional decisions and conflicts, major literary milestones, and of course his personal struggles and losses. So we'll get started in the year 1809. Poe was born in Boston, Massachusetts, to actors. Both his mother and father were actors, David Poe and Elizabeth Arnold. Elizabeth is seen here in an undated portrait miniature. This is the only known likeness we have of her. He has 2 siblings, an older brother, William Henry, and a younger sister, Rosalie. In 1811, separated from her husband, unfortunately we have no record of what happened to him, Poe's mother, Elizabeth, dies of tuberculosis in Richmond, Virginia. You see Richmond shown here in the 1830s. Richmond would become a kind of home base for Poe at various points in his life. Virginia's death on December 8th led to the postponement of a charity performance at the Richmond Theater, which was then rescheduled for the day after Christmas. During this performance, famously, the theater caught fire, killing 72 people, including the governor of Virginia, George William Smith. Following Virginia's death, the Poe children are split up. 3-year-old Edgar is adopted by John Allan. He's the proprietor of a successful import-export business in Richmond, and his wife, Frances. To protect his family name and help secure Poe's admission to West Point Military Academy later, John Allan would later fabricate the story that both Poe's parents died in the Richmond Theater fire. In 1815, John Allan relocates his family to Great Britain, where Edgar attends boarding school until the age of 11. In 1820, the Allans return to Richmond. Edgar continues schooling, excelling in languages, especially in writing. He develops a curious infatuation with Jane Stannard, the mother of one of his classmates, whom he would later in life call the first purely ideal love of my soul. And she's the inspiration for the poem To Helen, which appears in the 2nd edition of his poems in 1831. In 1825, Poe, just 16 years old, becomes engaged to Sarah Elmira Royster. She may have been only 14 or 15 at the time. Both families disapproved of the relationship and blocked their correspondence while Poe was away at the University of Virginia. She later goes on to marry another man, but will re-enter Poe's life shortly before his death in 1849. In 1826, Poe enrolls at the University of Virginia, Charlottesville. The university was founded by former President Thomas Jefferson and had only been open for a few years when Poe enrolled there. This view shows the famous rotunda, wildly out of proportion, which is still the focal point of the main campus there. But drinking, gambling, and mounting debts lead John Allen to withdraw Poe at the end of his first year. These disputes over money result in their more or less permanent estrangement until Allen's death in 1834. After he's withdrawn from the university, Poe leaves the Allen home for Boston. He enlists in the Army and is stationed at Fort Independence, but later transferred to Fort Moultrie in Charleston, South Carolina. He also publishes his first book at this time, Tamerlane and Other Poems. As you can see from the title page here, it was an anonymous publication. His name does not appear on the title page. He simply identifies himself as a Bostonian, by a Bostonian. In 1829, Poe's stepmother, Frances Allen, dies, and her death leads to a brief reconciliation with his stepfather, John, who agrees to assist Poe in procuring his discharge from the Army so that he could enroll at West Point Academy. While visiting Baltimore, Poe reconnects with his paternal aunt, Maria Poe Clem, who's recently widowed, and raising two children, including Poe's future wife, Virginia, who's only 7 years old at the time of their first meeting. He also publishes a volume of poems, Alaraf, Tamerlane, and Minor Poems, which contains 6 new poems. Notice how this time he publishes under his own name, but abbreviates his middle name, Allen. It's just A, Edgar A. Poe, perhaps despite his stepfather, a habit he would continue for the rest of his life. In 1830, Poe is admitted to West Point. It's a lovely view that shows the campus overlooking the Hudson River Valley. This kind of picturesque scenery re-echoes throughout some of Poe's fiction. But epistolary quarrels with his stepfather over financial assistance lead to Poe's misconduct and his expulsion from the academy the following year, and this results in a permanent break with Allen. In 1831, he publishes a second edition of poems. This is his third collection of verse now, containing mostly revisions of earlier poems, but with the addition of a half dozen new ones, including the To Helen poem mentioned earlier. The book opens with an epistolary essay on the subject of poetry, Poe's first printed piece of literary criticism, and this is significant because it is primarily as a literary critic and book reviewer that Poe supports himself in the early days of his career. In 1831, he also returns to Baltimore and moves in with the family of Maria Clem and begins tutoring 8-year-old Virginia. Starting in 1832, Poe begins publishing stories in weekly newspapers like the Philadelphia Saturday Courier and the Baltimore Saturday Visitor, and he takes first prize, $50, in a fiction contest for his story Manuscript Found in a Bottle. Here's the paper, published in October 1833. I'll highlight where the story begins there. Blow it up a little bit. It says, "The following is the tale to which the premium of $50 has been awarded by the committee. It will be found highly graphic in its style of composition." With this success, Poe plans a collection of stories, Tales of the Folio Club, and tries very hard for the next 3 years to make it happen. But he can't find a publisher for it. The publishers simply are not interested in publishing short stories, most of which had already appeared in print, so they instead advise him to submit a more profitable novel, which he would eventually do a few years later. In 1835, Poe is introduced by one of the judges of the Saturday Visitor contest, a man named John Kennedy, to Thomas White, publisher of the Southern Literary Messenger. That's a magazine you can see there. So Poe relocates back to Richmond to work on the magazine, submitting stories. One of these stories we'll be reading, Berenice, and copious book reviews. And it's Poe's work as a reviewer that probably did more than his stories to increase the profile of the magazine and bring him to the attention of the literary establishment. Poe was a severe critic, notoriously so, and objected to what he saw as venality, cronyism, and debased judgment in the American literary scene. And this acerbic reputation would stick with him for the rest of his career. The next year, 1836, he marries his 13-year-old cousin, Virginia, and moves both her and her mother, Maria Clem, to Richmond. While there's no question that Poe loved Virginia, or that she loved him, the marriage was hastened by financial pressures on the Clem family. The Clems were broke, desperately broke, and had been reduced to begging for money from relatives. Eventually, it was suggested that young Virginia should be transferred to the household of another family member, a move that would have put in doubt any future marriage plans. By marrying Virginia then and relocating the family from Baltimore to Richmond, Poe was not only, perhaps not even primarily motivated by love, but by more practical considerations of financial security. The portrait here shows Virginia shortly after her death in 1847 and may have been drawn by Mrs. Marie Louise Shue, who was Virginia's bedside nurse in her final weeks. For almost 2 years, Poe maintains a steady income as a columnist and eventually as editor of the Southern Literary Messenger, but a dispute with White over his salary leads to Poe's resignation from the magazine, disrupting serialization of the novel he's been working on, Arthur Gordon Pym. Only the first 2 parts of the novel would appear in the magazine, and so he relocates his family to New York. And in 1838, he finds a publisher for his novel, Harper, and it is published. His novel is published as the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. This was Poe's only complete novel, and it was not well received by Northern critics, some of whom were undoubtedly sore and vengeful after reading Poe's earlier reviews of their own work. And so aside from completing this novel, Poe was not very productive during this New York period, no doubt in part because he was unwelcome in the New York publishing world. So in 1839, he moves to Philadelphia and writes for the Gentleman's Magazine. This magazine is owned by the actor and playwright William Burton, and in it he publishes stories like The Fall of the House of Usher, among others. Also in 1839, Lee and Blanchard publishes Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. This is a 2-volume work that realizes Poe's goal of seeing his stories, 25 now in total, published as a collection. In 1840, he begins another long-form serial narrative, The Journal of Julius Rodman. But as was the case with Pym, publication of this novel is disrupted by disputes with Burton over editorial control of the Gentleman's Magazine, and so the novel is left unfinished. And unlike Pym, this one never finds a publisher and is never completed. At this time, Poe develops proposals for a magazine of his own. First, he decides to call it the Pen Magazine, and later he renamed it the Stylus. But these projects never come to fruition. Late in 1840, a young entrepreneur named George Graham buys the Gentleman's Magazine from Burton and renames it Graham's Magazine, and then rehires Poe as senior editor. Poe contributes popular stories like The Murders in the Rue Morgue that help to more than quadruple the magazine's subscribers. But he resigns in 1842, once again as was the case with Burton, it's a dispute over editorial control of the magazine, and after he leaves, he is succeeded by Rufus Wilmot Griswold. And I mention him because he will do a great deal later on to shape Poe's literary legacy and his personal reputation, and not always in good ways. At this point, Poe's wife, Virginia, begins to decline. Her health deteriorates. She's suffering, as did Poe's mother, from tuberculosis, which in the mid-19th century was as good as a death sentence. Once again, looking for financial stability while caring for his ailing wife and trying to start up his own magazine, Poe travels to Washington, D.C. to interview for a minor post in President Tyler's administration. But social awkwardness and intoxication sabotage this plan. Back in Philadelphia, however, he publishes The Gold Bug. This is a treasure hunting story that is set on Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, where he had been stationed in the Army at Fort Moultrie in the late 1820s. The Gold Bug goes on to become his most commercially successful story. It is reprinted many times, and it's even adapted for the stage. In 1844, he takes another shot at New York. He goes back and joins the staff of the New York Evening Mirror, another magazine, which would print his most well-known poem, if not the most widely recognized and appreciated American poem of the 19th century, The Raven. The following year, Wiley and Putnam would publish two important books, Tales and The Raven and Other Poems. The Tales is a collection of 12 stories showcasing Poe's popular detective fiction, as well as The Gold Bug. These are stories that were quite popular at the time, but had not appeared in the earlier Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque published by Lee and Blanchard. Obviously, The Raven and Other Poems was capitalizing on the enormous success of Poe's poem, the title poem, The Raven. Poe did not stay long with the Evening Mirror. He left that magazine for another one, the Broadway Journal, which would reprint his poem, The Raven. But this magazine would become the vehicle for the so-called Longfellow War. This is perhaps the most significant and damaging literary scandal of Poe's entire career. It was a series of attacks and counterattacks carried out in the press between Poe and supporters of the preeminent American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, whom Poe had accused of literary cronyism and plagiarism, among other things. Poe came out of it looking petty and mean, and as a consequence, he alienated himself from several important literary acquaintances. In a very different vein, however, the Broadway Journal was also the vehicle for his literary courtship of the poet Frances Osgood. Poe had previously accepted some of her verses in Graham's magazine, and they now exchanged warm, sentimental poems that would be easy, I think, for modern readers to misread as sincere love tokens. And some of Poe's rivals did attempt to use their relationship to drum up scandal about him. There must have been some attraction between Poe and Osgood, certainly, but I think their written exchanges are more accurately described as formalized expressions of friendship and appreciation. Frances, by all accounts, respected Poe's relationship with Virginia, and Virginia had once invited Frances to visit them at their home. And for her part, Virginia believed Frances had a benevolent and salubrious influence on Poe and helped keep him sober and even-tempered. Eventually, Poe becomes sole editor and proprietor of the Broadway Journal, finally realizing his dream of financial and editorial control over a magazine of his own. But it fails in early 1846, with his wife Virginia now bedridden and near death. 1847 is a difficult year for Poe, personally and professionally. Virginia dies on the 30th of January, and he sinks into depression and alcoholism and is nursed by his grieving mother-in-law, Maria Clem. He writes very little during this year, but his very fine poem, a favorite of mine and clearly a meditation on this loss, titled Ulalume, appears in the American Review at the end of the year. The following year, he publishes Eureka. It's a strange book. It's a lengthy, philosophical, semi mystical, quasi scientific meditation on the nature of the universe and the meaning of life. Uh, Poe, it was a work of high importance to Poe. He saw it as kind of a summative statement of his beliefs and values. He returns to Richmond in 1848, where he had started his writing career 13 years earlier. He reconnects with old friends, his sister Rosalie, and renews efforts to establish his own literary magazine, The Dream He Will Not Let Die. He also begins a relationship, rather intense it seems, with the poet and spiritualist Sarah Helen Whitman, who you see here in a striking daguerreotype portrait in profile. I love the geometry of her shawl and the really fixed intensity of her gaze here. The relationship, however, ends disastrously with her refusal of his marriage proposal, due primarily to the influence of Miss Whitman's relatives and friends. They say very disparaging things about Poe and kind of scare her off. Poe rather dramatically attempts to take his own life with an opium overdose, and but he recovers quickly, and in 1849 continues rebuilding his personal and professional life in Richmond, and becomes engaged for a second time to his childhood sweetheart, Sarah Elmira Royster, who's now recently widowed. Hop Frog, his last story, appears in March. In the fall of 1849, he embarks for New York, intending to return to Richmond with Maria Clem, who's now going on 60 years old. But for reasons unknown, he's waylaid in Baltimore, where he's found lying in the street, semi-conscious and delirious. 4 days later, on October the 7th, Poe dies. Only 4 people attended his burial in the cemetery of Westminster Presbyterian Church. Today, a marker identifies his original resting place in the cemetery, but in 1875, his coffin was exhumed and placed beneath a new monument, which you see pictured here in the southeast corner of the cemetery, where he was eventually reunited with the remains of his wife, Virginia, and Maria Clem, who had died in 1871. In 1850, Poe's literary executor, Rufus Wilmot Griswold, began editing and publishing Poe's collected works. Charles Dickens himself could not have come up with a more infelicitous, crude-sounding name than Rufus Wilmot Griswold to oppose to the sibilant, poetical name Edgar Allan Poe. Anyway, Griswold's edition, published by Redfield in 4 volumes, stands as the first important effort to secure the canon of Poe's fiction, poetry, and journalism, and it did a great deal to establish Poe's literary reputation in the long term. Unfortunately, however, this edition also includes Griswold's scurrilous and often fraudulent memoir of Poe. Motivated by years of professional and personal resentment, he emphasizes the most negative aspects of Poe's life and character. He grossly exaggerates others, and he even makes up a lot of stuff that never happened. Griswold was one of the first and certainly the most influential writer to popularize the largely fictional portrait of Poe as the mad, spiteful, drug-addicted, self-destructive genius. Ironically, as unfair as this portrait is to Poe, we owe some thanks to Griswold for creating the Poe myth that has fired readers' imaginations and maintained interest in his works, which are often interpreted through the lens of his troubled and tragic life. My first exposure to Poe occurred when I was 8 or 9 years old, and the first story I read was The Murders in the Rue Morgue, included in Macmillan's Pocket Classics edition of Poe's prose tales published in 1901, which fortunately I still have in my possession, along with a companion volume of Poe's poems, part of an heirloom library that was inherited by my father, much of which eventually wound up being shelved in my childhood bedroom. The edition we'll be using in this course is the Norton, edited by G.R. Thompson, the great Poe scholar, and it is to this text that I will refer in future lectures on individual stories and poems. While the Norton is appropriate for students in an introductory course like this one, it is not a scholarly or variorum edition, and if you're interested, the best print edition of Poe's stories and poems that I'm aware of is still Thomas Olive Mabbitt's 3-volume collected works. I'll show you the first volume. They're rather hefty to pull them off my shelf, but they're quite pretty. It's 3 volumes published by Harvard University Press between 1969 and 1978, and it's still available in paperback from the University of Illinois Press. Occasionally, I will introduce information from these volumes as well to explain printing history or point out noteworthy text variants, of which there are a great many in Poe's work. And that brings to an end this video introducing Edgar Allan Poe.